World News. Militants have destroyed most of a convoy carrying NATO supplies near the Pakistani capital of Islamabad. At least 7 people were killed and about 50 vehicles set on fire. Police say up to 12 gunmen had struck the convoy as it was using a truck stop. The UN Security Council is expected to vote on Wednesday on whether to impose new sanctions on Iran over its nuclear program. The proposed measures include tighter financial and shipping restrictions. The US Interior Department has issued rigorous new requirements for all offshore drilling. Companies will have to provide independent verification, but the blowout preventer works. Its failure on a BP rig caused the Gulf of Mexico oil spill. And the Mexican president, Felipe Calderón, has said that the shooting dead of a 14-year-old Mexican boy by a US Border Patrol agent on Tuesday was a disproportionate use of force. Those are the main headlines.
Making sense of the world of business and finance now on BBC World News, World Business Report.
World Business Report is sponsored by SR, Let's Begin, and State Bank of India, the banker to every Indian.
Last Chance Saloon. Spain's Zapatero must find an agreement with unions today if he is to avoid a summer of strikes. And the IMF warns of a subdued economic recovery and says Asia might have to lead the way forward. Hello, welcome to World Business Report. I'm Jamie Robertson. Well, a day of tough negotiations in store for Spain's Prime Minister. José Luis Zapatero presents to unions the first draft of a plan which would radically change the Spanish labour market. It would make it easier for companies to hire and to fire. And that's unlikely to be popular, of course, with the unions, which are already protesting over wage cuts. Sarah Rainsford reports now from Madrid.
Spain's trade unions were always close to the socialist government. This week they called a mass strike against its austerity plans. They're now promising further action over labour reform. The government's been trying to reach agreement on reforms it says will make the labour market more flexible and encourage firms to start hiring again. But the unions fear its measures chip away at workers' rights.
More people lost their jobs in Spain than any country in Europe in the crisis. A lot of temporary workers were sacked without compensation. Now they want to make it easier to fire long-term workers too. That would mean even more people losing their jobs in a downturn.
Unemployment in Spain now stands at 20%. But the government argues firms won't hire staff on long-term contracts because they then owe 45 days severance pay per year if they sack them. The reform reduces that and allows firms to cut staff hours in a downturn instead of firing them. The EU is pushing for this to help kickstart Spain's struggling economy.
Spain is currently preparing a substantial labour market reform and also a substantial reform of the pension system. And I can only encourage Spain to pursue this.
But the difficulties were already clear as the clean-up from Tuesday's public sector strike began.
Well, despite this damp end to the strike, the trade unions are claiming it was a success, but what they're saying is it's just the first of many. And when it comes to the very controversial issue of labour reform, they're already talking about a general strike.
If they can't reach a deal on Wednesday, the government says it will impose this reform alone. This is the last chance for compromise. Sarah Rainsford, BBC News, Madrid.
Well, there were words of warning from the International Monetary Fund this morning. It warns of a subdued economic recovery, and it says there are risks that it could simply peter out. The comments came from the Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, Naoki Shinohara, in a speech that he made in Singapore. Well, Mariko Oy is in the BBC's Singapore office. Can you tell us what he said, some detail of what he said?
Well, Jamie, Mr. Shinohara basically warns that of a spillover effect of the European debt crisis here in Asia. The most obvious impact will be on global trade, in particular demand for Asian products. And because many of the region's economies still rely heavily on exporting their goods to the rest of the world, including Europe, those economies wouldn't be immune to what's happening in the Eurozone. But exports to Europe had been rather weak because of the global recession in the last few years, so probably a bigger concern is whether this would lead to another financial crisis, just like what we saw after the collapse of Lehman Brothers.
And in the coming years or months, what role does Asia play?
Well, it definitely seems like the economic power is shifting towards Asia. Today we had a leaked report from China that exports there in May have grown by almost 50% from a year ago. That's almost 20% stronger than what analysts were expecting. We also heard from the Monetary Authority of Singapore that the economy here is expected to grow by almost 9% in 2010. So that's the kind of figure that the Western economies would be very envious of. But according to Mr. Shinohara, that means that Asia is attracting more capital, which also means that it could result in some economies overheating unless appropriate policy action was taken. He suggests more flexible